In fewer than 50 years, French immersion has gone from an aspirational idea to one of the most highly sought-after programs offered in the public school system in this country. The story of how that happened involves much more than just a debate about curriculum. Matthew Hayday is professor of history at the University of Guelph and author of So They Want Us to Learn French, Promoting and Opposing Bilingualism in English-Speaking Canada. And he joins us now to explain. Nice to have you here at TVO.
Thanks for having me.
First time on our program, I think.
It is, yes.
Yeah, good to have you here. All right, French immersion, how it all began 50 years ago. Tell us what went into that decision.
It's coming out of the context of the early 1960s, that you have the Quiet Revolution going on in Quebec, nationalism is on the rise, but it's really something that's about parents deciding that it would be advantageous for their children to become bilingual. So it starts off with some basically small private school initiatives. Actually, here in Toronto, the Toronto French School came together because of a small group of parents that thought they wanted their children to have the opportunities that would come from being bilingual.
And it's still there, 10 minutes from this studio.
10 minutes from this studio. And that spawned some imitators as private schools. It's in 1965 on the south shore of the St. Lawrence, just a suburb of Montreal in St. Lambert, though, that you get the program that really launches everything, where you have an experimental program with the South Shore School Board. It's parents in Quebec who thought, English-speaking parents in Quebec who thought their kids needed to be bilingual. They fought long and hard to convince their school board to take a gamble on an experiment, to have their children study in French. It was backed by educators, it was wildly successful, and it spawned imitators across the country.
Was that Quebec experiment controversial at the time?
At the time it was, partly because of a certain amount of, let's be honest, Anglophone bigotry. School administrators with that board thought that there was no good reason for these children to be educated in French. They thought English education was superior. So even then...
Let's just understand this. English parents in the province of Quebec, where 95% of the people spoke French,
yes,
thought it was still silly to educate children in French.
School administrators fought them tooth and nail on it initially, but they managed to find a pile of allies, including educators at McGill, to do this. They were quite convinced of the merits of it. And they actually worked together with some of the people at the Toronto French School to get some advice about how to get these sorts of programs set up.
It then spreads, of course, to English Canada through the public school system. How contentious was all of that? It
was quite contentious. I mean, it starts off fairly low-key because you have experiments in Ottawa, in Toronto, in other parts of the country where it starts off as just a pilot project. You'll start in one school, you start with kindergarten and grade 1, and you add 1 grade per year. In that experimental phase, it can vary depending on the context as to whether or not school administrators are willing to take the risk on it. It's as it starts to grow and you get more and more demand and public, there's a lot more awareness of these programs and their potential, that you start getting into issues of cost and validity, and especially in the context of the 1970s, where you have the separatist scare. French immersion runs headlong into opposition to bilingualism in terms of how the federal government is doing things, and it runs headlong into some, quite frankly, vicious anti-French sentiment that begins being expressed by anti-bilingualism social groups.
Okay, 50 years ago was kind of too long ago for me to remember firsthand, but I do remember a couple of other controversies in education firsthand, and I want you to help, you're the Department of History guy, put this into some kind of historical perspective. Full funding for Catholic schools in the province of Ontario,
yes.
1985. Faith-based funding offered by the Conservatives in 2007. Those both turned into huge political footballs. Compare bilingualism and the efforts for bilingual education to those.
I would say that the controversies are even more full-blown than that, partly because of the extent to which they've not gone away. Every year, you will see editorials and op-eds in newspapers criticizing French immersion as being elitist, as they call into question whether or not it teaches English or French effectively. There is this sense that French immersion is being called private school for, effectively private school for the middle class paid for on the public dime. You have seen those types of criticisms lobbed at it and heated fights at the school board level going back to the late 1970s. And the terms of those debates have not changed. Every year you see it over and over again, and unless I'm mistaken, you probably are aware of the controversy earlier this summer when Margaret Wente and Marcus Guy and other Canadian columnists basically trotted out exactly the same arguments that were being used 30, 40 years ago.
As far as you're concerned, is the verdict in?
I think the verdict should be in. What surprises me is that people keep on reviving it as if it is a source of major controversy. It's the same myths that get trumpeted, that have been disproven by education researchers, that have been challenged effectively. I can understand why, to a certain extent, they get trotted out, because there has been, to a certain extent, a lack of will on the part of federal and provincial governments to fund these programs as effectively as they could be. There are interest groups that have very real concerns about what would happen if French immersion was allowed on demand, and what that might mean for, say, English-speaking teachers in the province of Ontario who view French immersion as a threat to their jobs.
Well, but theoretically, I mean, theoretically, we do have French immersion on demand in the province of Ontario, right?
We absolutely do not have French immersion on demand in the province of Ontario.
Theoretically.
Not even theoretically, even by law. I mean, there are cases in other provinces, like New Brunswick, where they passed laws back in the early 80s. They've changed things since then that said if you had a minimum number of parents, the school district had to offer French immersion to those students. We don't have that in the province of Ontario. There are still school boards that don't offer it at all. And school boards that do have it often cap the number of students who are allowed to enroll in those programs. I mean, I'm from Guelph. The Upper Grand District School Board just this past year put in a policy planning to implement caps as of 2017. This is not a resolved issue, and it's not immersion on demand for all.
And the caps are there because?
Because demand is so high, they don't feel that they've got the capacity to meet it in terms of finding qualified teachers. And that, again, this issue of getting enough teachers for immersion, this is something that goes back to the early 1980s. This isn't a new problem that's suddenly emerged. It's one that has not been addressed, even though there has been awareness and there has been lobbying around this issue for decades.
But as far as your research is concerned and your experience with this issue, French immersion is unambiguously, on balance, a good thing.
On balance, absolutely.
It's important to say on balance.
Yes. Yeah. I'm a historian. I have to qualify everything I say. There are certainly areas of immersion that could be improved. On balance, though, it's absolutely a good thing.
Have organizations such as Canadian Parents for French succeeded in selling it as a program that, for example, never mind the issue about whether it makes you better Canadian because you know both official languages of the country, but just how about some of the science? It's better for brain development. It's better for early childhood education development, that kind of thing.
That has, they've absolutely done a good job at this. Canadian Parents for French has been around since 1977 doing these efforts, so they're almost 40 years old themselves. They're actually they're a month younger than I am, as it turns out. But the issue of national unity hasn't really been a selling feature for French immersion for decades. If you look at studies of why parents put their kids in French immersion, national unity is actually usually very far down on the list.
You find that surprising?
I thought I would be surprised. I think a lot of the people who become leaders in the movement, and certainly in the 70s, it was more important to them. But it's really been more about job opportunities. It's been about educational enrichment. This issue of the cognitive development pieces, that's actually fairly recent studies that have started pointing to that. And that has become a major motivator for parents.
It's interesting because, of course, when the first Prime Minister Trudeau was in office, the notion of everybody learning the other official language was to help create a more harmonious country. And that seems not to be one of the arguments why parents want their children in bilingual education nowadays.
Yeah,
that's odd.
It is odd, but it's also true that to a certain extent, the federal government's take on it was that they really only wanted enough people to learn French or English speakers to learn French to be able to make sure that the government could work, that it could provide services to what was still, they envisioned, going to be a country where most people only spoke one language or the other. And it's one of those things that gets lost in these debates over bilingualism is the number of unilingual francophones in Quebec. I mean, the myth in English Canada is like, well, everyone in Quebec speaks English and French. No, really, especially once you get to Montreal, absolutely no, they don't. But the government needs to be able to provide both services. And that's why the federal government actually provides some subsidies to the province for French immersion, because they're basically making sure they can get enough people in the public service who can provide these services.
And I presume it's certainly empirically provable that English and French are an asset when it comes to getting a job in the federal public service.
Absolutely.
Goes beyond saying.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Is it still controversial today like it was 50 years ago?
It's controversial in different ways today. I mean, 50 years ago, it was controversial partly because people would very openly speak out against French and against the province of Quebec. You had these anti-bilingualism conspiracy books that came out. A very popular one was called Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, Trudeau's Master Plan and How It Can Be Stopped. bestseller on the Toronto Star bestseller lists in the late 1970s.
Who wrote that?
Lieutenant Colonel Jock Andrew. And he wrote two
yes,
follow-up
yes,
sequels
yes,
in the 1980s.
Yes.
And you had a group called the Alliance for the Preservation of English in Canada.
APAC,
and that ran through the Meech Lake and Charlottetown years. Those groups have really faded out. So you don't see anti-French sentiments being targeted at French immersion the same way. It gets questioned more on this issue of elitism, on whether you have adequate access. These days, the controversies often swirl around children with special needs and whether they are being unfairly streamed out of French immersion. Which, I mean, again, this is a problem that was identified in the early 1980s and has taken a long time to have people actually start to address it. And the province of Ontario actually now has ministerial guidelines about how to include most children with special needs in French immersion or core French, whatever option they take.
It's actually fascinating to look south of the border because much of what I guess we went through 50 and 40 years ago, they're going through now with Spanish. And the English as a first language people in the United States fearing that everybody's going to have to learn Spanish in the future. I don't know, it feels to me, maybe you can comment on this, those feel like echoes of debates that we had in this country 4 decades ago.
There definitely are echoes. What's really interesting is I've attended language policy and language learning conferences that bring together people who are dealing with this in a variety of different countries. And what's very funny is that there they view Canada as the model. You go to Ireland where they're trying to revive Gaelic. They look at Canada as a model for how you can do this. Wales is trying to improve the status of French. They turn to Canada. People in Southeast Asia are looking at Canadian models for it. So externally, what Canada has done is largely seen as a success, but we're still sort of wrapped up in some of our infighting around it. With your example of the United States, I mean, the English-only movements, those go back several decades. And it's somewhat different there because when you're dealing with the Spanish debates there, a lot of the unease about it is about immigration. Whereas our fights over French tend to be different because you're dealing with multi-generational Quebecers and Franco-Ontarians and Franco-Albertans and so forth. So there is an anti-immigration cast to it that's somewhat different than what we have here.
But I guess part of the fear certainly in the French-speaking parts of Canada is that, ever been to New Orleans?
I haven't.
Okay, well, you got to go to New Orleans someday and you see what Quebec fears would have been its future. French essentially disappearing from use, kind of a quaint old historic relic, but that's about it. I guess, bilingual education made sure that's not going to happen here. Is that fair to say?
Certainly it's a good hope that it's not going to happen here. I mean, there was recently a poll released from the Commissioner of Official Languages Office about Canadian support for bilingualism that showed that it's very strong, over 80% on a variety of different questions. But when you drill down to the level of how many Canadians are becoming bilingual, it's still far greater proportion of Francophones than English speakers who are becoming bilingual. And I've seen some rumblings in the Quebec press that's concerned about the extent to which the burden of bilingualism is being borne by people whose mother tongue is French, even in Montreal where the population is overwhelmingly Francophone. So I don't know that the issue is completely resolved yet. I think it's certainly on far more stable ground than it was 40, 50 years ago.
Sure, but if you had to gauge where you think the majority of the population in the country is today in terms of its seriousness and commitment to being a bilingual country, where do you think we're at?
I think we're at the point where we accept that our federal government is going to do it. We're going to say that we support bilingualism wholeheartedly. We might send our children to French immersion or encourage them to learn French, but we're not going to lose sleep over it if they drop it after high school. There is a certain amount of bilingualism as a motherhood statement that Canadians like the idea of bilingualism, as long as we're not going to force people to stick with it any longer.
Did you take it?
I took core French all the way through. I'm just young enough that a lot of the myths about French immersion were still very dominant in the early 1980s, and my parents feared that if they sent me to French immersion, I would come out not speaking English or French very well. And that goes back to, that was one of the big myths. I think it still exists today. And all the research shows that by grade 3 or 4, it sorts itself out. And the only reason that English skills lag is because, well, you're teaching the kids entirely in French for the first 2 or 3 years. You haven't started teaching them formal English grammar. This sorts itself out over time. I wish my parents had sent me to French immersion. I would be much more confident in my spoken French than I am today.
Your French is probably pretty good, though.
It's pretty good, but I did an undergraduate degree in French literature and then went to the University of Ottawa for my MA and PhD with Francophone friends, so that helps.
Did you study in French?
I took a couple of courses in French at the graduate level.
How'd you do?
Reasonably well. My Francophone colleagues always tell me that my French is far better than I give myself credit for.
You know what? Do they really mean that, or do they just say that to make you feel better?
They invite me on. They invite me to go on French-speaking roundtables, and Radio Canada has told me that when I've done interviews with them, that I've done just fine. And on your sister network, TVO, they said that I was, or TFO rather, they said that I did pretty well too.
Bravo, monsieur. Félicitations.
Merci beaucoup.
C'était un grand plaisir.
C'était un plaisir pour moi aussi.
À cette émission. That's about the best I can do. Matthew Hayday, he is the Associate Chair and Graduate Program Coordinator in the Department of History at the University of Guelph and the author of So They Want Us to Learn French. Yes, they do. Matthew, good to meet you, and thanks for coming into TVO tonight.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.